The silent native messengers who crossed 500 miles in days left no trails behind. They carried treaties in knotted belts, signals in smoke, and warnings in drumbeats. Enemies never cracked their codes. But how could silence defeat armies?
We move at dawn, under the cover of the mist. Take the north path.
Trails older than maps carried footsteps faster than horses ever could. Long before European settlers carved maps and borders, the land was already a woven network of trails, some of them thousands of years old. These were not random paths, but living highways carved by generations of native travelers, traders, and messengers. They wound through dense forests, hugged the banks of rivers, and climbed mountain ridges with uncanny precision. One of the greatest examples was the Natchez Trace, a 440-mile corridor used by tribes like the Chickasaw and Choctaw. This trail connected the Mississippi River to the Appalachian foothills. Archaeologists estimate parts of it had been walked for at least 8,000 years. Imagine that. Footsteps pressed into earth before the pyramids of Egypt were even built. On these trails, runners could move faster than mounted cavalry. Horses, after all, needed feed and water, but a trained runner carried only determination and endurance. Some could cover 50 to 70 miles in a single day, far outpacing the average colonial courier on horseback. Every bend of these paths had meaning. Certain oaks marked rest points, streams became refueling stations, and ridges served as natural lookout posts. To an outsider, it looked like wilderness. To a messenger, it was a perfectly memorized map. Even more astonishing, these trails were connected like veins across the continent. The Great Trail Network stretched from modern-day Canada all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Messages, trade goods, and even news of war could ripple across entire regions in days. The trails weren't just dirt. They were arteries of power. Whoever controlled them controlled knowledge, and in ancient warfare, knowledge was the deadliest weapon. But sometimes one runner wasn't enough. That's when the human chains came alive, moving like living lightning across the land. But a single runner was never enough, so human chains moved like living lightning. One man could run for miles, but no matter how strong, no one could outrun exhaustion forever. That's why native messengers built something Europeans never expected: relay chains of human endurance. A runner would push himself for 20, 30, even 50 miles, then hand the message to another who was waiting, already fresh and ready to sprint. This wasn't improvisation, it was a perfected system. The Inca called their runners chasqui, and their empire stretched more than 2,500 miles across the Andes. These messengers moved news, orders, and even fresh fish from the coast to highland kings in just 2 days, a journey that would take caravans weeks. Though we speak of the Inca, similar systems existed among North American nations. Pueblo runners in the Southwest could carry corn, turquoise, and warnings across desert heat at staggering speeds, linking villages separated by hundreds of miles. A relay like this was faster than any cavalry unit. Horses needed rest every 20 miles. A human chain didn't. It was pure endurance stacked end to end. Some messages could travel over 500 miles in just 5 days, a speed unmatched until the telegraph in the 19th century. The magic was in preparation. Villages knew their runners, trained from youth, bodies hardened by fasting, cold, and distance. Each knew their segment of the trail like the lines on their palms. No hesitation, no wasted breath. When a crisis struck, that human lightning lit up the land. But speed wasn't everything. Even a flawless relay risked interception. A spoken message could be overheard, twisted, or betrayed. That's why words began to share their burden with something more powerful: horns carved from buffalo that carried thunder across the plains. Yet words alone weren't always safe, so horns carved from buffalo carried thunder. A voice could be silenced, but a horn could roar across valleys. Native messengers knew that sometimes speed wasn't enough. Messages had to be heard by hundreds at once, and they had to reach farther than a sprinting man. That's where horns carved from buffalo or elk came alive as weapons of sound. A single blast could travel over 3 miles in open plains. In forests, echoes bent and stretched the tone until it felt like thunder rolling just above the trees. Different lengths and carvings produced unique pitches, each assigned to meanings only insiders understood. 1 blast could summon a council, 3 could signal danger, and a rapid series might mean enemies were moving now. Outsiders only heard noise, insiders heard orders. Horns weren't random tools. Among Plains tribes like the Lakota and Cheyenne, carved horns often accompanied war parties. Scouts used them to warn villages before cavalry arrived, buying precious minutes to move families or prepare defenses. In the Iroquois Confederacy, animal horn trumpets sometimes marked council gatherings, signaling warriors and clan mothers to assemble. But there was a risk. Sound carried to enemies too. Soldiers wrote accounts of hearing eerie blasts in the distance, only to be attacked hours later. Some believed it was superstition, but for native messengers, it was careful choreography. By the time outsiders guessed what the sound meant, the move was already in motion. The brilliance was not just volume, but ambiguity. Horns made meaning impossible to steal unless you were born into the code. That secrecy forced adaptation, because if enemies camped close enough, even sound might betray you. And when thunder became dangerous, the signal rose higher still, into the language of smoke. And when horns risked interception, smoke rose skyward in secret codes. Fire became ink, and the sky turned into parchment. Native messengers used smoke signals not as vague plumes, but as carefully coded language, each puff loaded with meaning. To an outsider, it looked like campfire smoke drifting lazily. To those who knew, it was a warning that could save hundreds. Different nations perfected their own variations. Among the Apache, a quick succession of short puffs might mean enemy spotted. A long column could signal all is safe. The Navajo built fires with damp grasses, so smoke rose dark and heavy, carrying farther across desert horizons. Plains tribes often burned dry sage or cedar, creating bright white plumes that contrasted against blue skies. What astonished early European soldiers was not the smoke itself, but the speed. A message could leapfrog 40 to 60 miles in under an hour as distant watchers lit their own fires to repeat the signal. In a world before telegraphs, this was an internet made of smoke and discipline. Secrecy gave it strength. Enemies might see smoke, but could not break the code. Outsiders guessed wrongly that 2 puffs meant peace and 3 meant war. In truth, the combinations shifted constantly, understood only by those trained from childhood. And smoke wasn't limited to war. It called hunters back to villages, guided lost travelers, or signaled when fishing runs began. Some accounts even suggest smoke was used during trading fairs, so groups miles away would know when to gather. But smoke had one fatal flaw. It vanished with wind and weather. A sudden storm could erase a message mid-sentence. And when air itself proved untrustworthy, messages had to be knotted into things no wind could scatter: cords, belts, and beads that carried memory in silence. But not every message was air and fire. Some were knotted into cords and belts. When the sky grew too stormy for smoke and horns risked being overheard, messages had to be tied into memory itself. Wampum belts in the northeast and quipu-like knotted cords further south became the silent archives of native diplomacy. Each bead, knot, or weave held meanings that no enemy ear could ever steal. The Haudenosaunee, Iroquois Confederacy, used wampum belts as living treaties. Made of shell beads, often purple and white, they carried agreements between nations. A belt could be dozens of rows wide, each pattern a story or oath. In 1613, the famous 2-row wampum belt was created, symbolizing Dutch and Haudenosaunee sailing side by side in peace. That one object contained more law than pages of written contracts. Knotted cords also had power. Some were used to track tribute or promises, others to remind a messenger of each detail to be spoken. One cord might carry 20 or more knots, each representing a point in a speech memorized word for word. This was more than memory, it was encryption in thread. European observers, baffled by the accuracy, admitted these cords and belts preserved details for generations without a single slip. Jesuit missionaries wrote of councils where chiefs recited treaties word for word decades later, guided only by beads. A belt could weigh less than a pound, yet carry the history of 5 nations. The strength of cords and belts was endurance. While smoke vanished in minutes, a wampum belt might endure centuries. Some are still held in tribal museums today, their messages alive. But even threads had borders. When messages had to leap between dozens of nations, no bead or knot could travel as fast as hands moving in silence across open plains. Still, no knot or smoke could cross every border, so hands spoke in silence. Across the Great Plains, dozens of nations spoke different tongues: Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa. Yet they needed one language no ear could mistranslate. Out of necessity came the Plains Sign Language, one of the most sophisticated gesture systems ever developed, understood from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi River. Unlike casual hand signals, this was a full-blown lingua franca. Over 40 tribes used it, with a vocabulary of more than 3,000 gestures. A warrior could sign "Buffalo over the hill," "We come in peace," or "Prepare for war," without uttering a sound. Outsiders were often fooled, thinking it was pantomime, when in reality treaties, trade negotiations, and war councils were carried out entirely by hand. What made it powerful was precision. A gesture for horse used 2 fingers walking on the palm. Enemy involved a sharp motion slicing across the chest. Friend softened the hands, palms turning outward. It meant that a Blackfoot trader could bargain with a Crow, or a Kiowa chief could ally with an Apache without sharing a spoken word. American explorers were stunned. In 1806, Zebulon Pike recorded how his guides spoke in gestures to tribes hundreds of miles apart, perfectly understood. By the late 19th century, U.S. cavalry scouts admitted they relied on native sign language to communicate across units in silence because shouting meant death. This silent tongue even outlived its battlefield origins. Early ethnographers wrote that at the 1930 Plains Indian Sign Language Council, over 20 tribes still gathered to keep it alive. Hands carried history when words divided. But hand signs alone could not always mask intent. Sometimes silence needed rhythm, disguise, or sound. That's when songs, drums, and flutes began carrying secret codes across valleys, wrapped in the skin of prayer. And when silence wasn't enough, songs disguised themselves as prayer and rhythm. A drumbeat could sound like worship, but to those who knew the code, it was a battlefield telegram. Songs, flutes, and chants became the camouflage of communication, slipping under the ears of enemies who thought they were listening to nothing more than ritual or celebration. Among the Lakota, steady drum rhythms were more than music. They were coded timing signals. A sudden break in the beat could mean a scout had returned with news. 2 sharp strikes, then silence, might signal the beginning of a raid. The Hopi and Zuni used flutes in desert canyons, the echo carrying notes far beyond a human voice. To outsiders, it was haunting music. To insiders, it was direction, instruction, or warning. Anthropologists uncovered that some songs carried entire messages. A Navajo chant, repeated with subtle changes in verse order, told runners where to meet. Pueblo dances, with alternating foot stamps, sometimes doubled as a call for warriors to gather after the ritual ended. Outsiders watched performances for color and spectacle, never realizing orders were being passed in plain sight. Even enslaved Africans later borrowed this brilliance. Spirituals sung in the fields hid escape plans to the north, echoing the native use of sacred music as shield and sword. It shows how sound, when coded, could become a map only the trained could read. But sound, like smoke, risked interception. A rival might recognize a rhythm, or a misplaced echo could betray intent. When the need for proof and permanence arose, when no song, smoke, or sign was safe, messages burned brighter. Fire itself had to be carried alive, glowing through the night, never allowed to die. But when messages demanded proof, fire itself had to be carried alive. Carrying a spark across miles wasn't just about light, it was about trust. Among many native nations, flame itself became a messenger, passed carefully from hand to hand, kept alive for days inside bundles of bark and resin. A fire wasn't simply heat, it was a treaty, a warning, or a vow too sacred to risk losing. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy spoke of keeping the council fire burning as a sign of unity. To relight it from scratch would be betrayal, so embers were carried to prove continuity. Archaeologists found evidence that coals could be wrapped in punkwood and moss, glowing for 72 hours straight without extinguishing. Runners guarded these embers like they were royal jewels. Among Plains tribes, carrying fire was often a war message. A burning bundle delivered to another village was a silent signal that war councils had agreed. In the Andes, where native traditions mixed, Spanish chroniclers described how fire carried across valleys meant either alliance or rebellion. It traveled faster than letters because flame could not be forged. Either it was alive or it wasn't. There were practical uses too. When large hunting parties moved, one runner would carry fire ahead, so cooking and warmth could begin instantly at camp. In a time before matches, this meant survival itself. Losing the ember meant reliving the exhausting work of friction fire, often hours in the making. But there was danger. Drop the bundle, and a prairie blaze could consume miles of grassland. Fumble the coal, and treaties could be seen as broken. Fire was alive, loyal to no one, and yet it became the courier no enemy could intercept. Yet even flame had limits. It proved truth, but not memory. That burden fell on the messengers themselves, who carried entire treaties word for word in nothing but their minds. Yet the greatest risk wasn't in flame or sound, but in silence itself. Some of the most dangerous messages were carried with no horn, no smoke, not even a scrap of bark to mark the words. They lived only inside a messenger's memory. A single person could hold an entire treaty, sometimes thousands of words long, with not a syllable forgotten. One mistake could unravel peace or spark war. Among the Iroquois Confederacy, wampum belts recorded the skeleton of an agreement, but the flesh of meaning stayed in the voice of the messenger. French Jesuits in the 1600s wrote with awe that native envoys could recite terms for hours, repeating them verbatim across councils miles apart. There was no notebook to check, no paper trail to dispute. The proof was in flawless delivery. Think about the pressure. A messenger carrying promises between the Ojibwe and Dakota might run 200 miles in under 4 days, all while rehearsing every line in their head. One stumble of the tongue and an enemy could accuse them of lying. There are records of rival nations deliberately trying to confuse envoys with questions just to catch them contradicting themselves. The Aztec Empire, too, used runners called Painani, who memorized royal orders and sprinted them across a road network that spanned 15,000 miles of stone causeways. They carried no paper because interception meant death. Silence was their shield. Even when words were remembered perfectly, delivery carried weight. A calm voice could turn a threat into a treaty. A trembling one could turn friendship into suspicion. Historians note that many envoys were trained orators, not just runners, because memory meant nothing without presence. This trust in silence was terrifying. It meant nations rose and fell on the memory of one tired, hungry, breathless human being. And sometimes the burden broke them. leading to the most haunting fate of all. When a messenger vanished and silence itself became the deadliest answer. And in the end, one runner's silence could decide if a nation lived or fell. Not every message arrived. Sometimes the silence of a missing runner was louder than war drums. In native diplomacy, when a message failed to come, whole alliances collapsed overnight. Villages packed their belongings, chiefs armed their men, and treaties dissolved. Not because of betrayal, but because a single step had been delayed or lost. There are oral traditions among the Creek and Choctaw that speak of envoys vanishing into forests, never to be seen again. Did they die of exhaustion? Did enemies intercept them? Or did they choose silence, deciding that carrying such weight was too much for one body? The mystery itself became part of the punishment, for silence was taken as refusal. Spanish chroniclers recorded stories of Pueblo runners who were tasked with carrying revolt signals in 1680. More than 70 messengers with knotted cords were sent across hundreds of miles to synchronize rebellion. A few cords never arrived. Historians debate whether they were captured, killed, or deliberately stopped. That tiny silence nearly unraveled the greatest native uprising of colonial America. Among the Haudenosaunee, silence itself could be a sentence. If a runner did not speak at the council fire, their absence meant their people had withdrawn. One missed voice could fracture a confederacy that had stood for centuries. The terror of silence was that it left everything unanswered. Was it betrayal, death, or strategy? Chiefs had to gamble on the meaning. Sometimes they struck first, leading to wars that might never have begun if the runner had simply arrived. In the end, the fate of nations balanced on fragile lungs and tired legs. A war might start not with a shout, but with the quiet of footsteps that never came. Thanks for watching. Silent messengers shaped history in ways armies couldn't. If you enjoyed uncovering these hidden stories, subscribe for more forgotten truths. Every video takes us deeper into the past, so don't miss what comes next. The best secrets are still waiting.